Hello, welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me in the studio for Shaka Extra Time is Shaka himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
Welcome to another edition of Shaka Extra Time.
Thank you very, very much. Are you terrific, given that at least you know what the results are? And your friend seems to retain his position at State House, Nairobi.
I'm cautiously optimistic, Shaka. Before we start, let me welcome all our Facebook followers watching us from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to ask questions and talk to your man, Shaka himself. Today, we are once again talking about Kenya. We'll probably go into Uganda also, and maybe perhaps Liberia. But let's start off in Kenya. Very, very interesting developments in Kenya. Obviously, the Electoral Commission there, IBEC, announced Uhuru Kenyatta as president-elect. But today we had a significant development come out of Raila's side, the NASA side. They said they are forming the People's Assembly. I don't know what that means. Maybe bring us up to speed, Shaka.
Well, they talk about a People's Assembly, but really it's a consultative body that is very broad in nature. You're talking about, like elected officials, people from civil society. We're talking about church leaders and what have you, and trade unions and you name it, and all ordinary Kenyan people who are interested in democracy and have concerns about the manner in which the last presidential repeat election was conducted on October 26.
President Uhuru Kenyatta, or President-elect Kenyatta, talks about this is a validation of the mandate that was given to him on August 8th. And in fact, he continues to say that this is proof that he actually won that election. On the other hand, the rival, his main rival, Raila Odinga, who leads the NASA coalition, says that this was a sham election. What should we take, or what's your thought on that?
First of all, Paul, it depends, frankly, what you want to believe and who you want to believe. But the facts are very, very stubborn. For example, Kenyatta, the IEBC says he pretty much got about 7.5 million votes. In fact, they also say that it is 7.6 million voters out of the more than 19.6 million voters who actually turned out on Thursday, October 26. We do have some other sources, probably sources, in fact, that are impeccable, suggesting that you probably did not have more than 30% of the registered voters, in fact, coming to the poll. As a matter of fact, some of the numbers range between 3 and 3.5 million voters. And it's quite possible, Paul, because we saw the lines, for example, or did not see the lines. Incredibly, even in Jubilee strongholds, we're talking about Gatundu, the home area of President Uhuru Kenyatta. There were not very many people really who came to vote. We're talking about Kiambu. You hear about the Kiambu Mafia. There were not many people who turned out to vote, except, of course, Nyeri, Mount Kenya, the home, of course, of former President Mwai Kibaki. That's where there were very many people. So when you look at the Jubilee strongholds, really, where you have questionable turnout, and then, of course, you go to the NASA strongholds, pretty much really boycotted, frankly, the event. You wonder where some of those figures, which are in 7 million, may have been actually gotten from. So if it is true, for example, that there was no strong turnout for Uhuru Kenyatta, it probably raises that particular election. In a sense, people may begin to say, wait a minute, does this, in fact, this guy have legitimacy? Does he really have or command the confidence of the Kenyan people? That will probably be his political sort of what am I trying to say, really? It might be a political problem for him, because he may, in fact, be losing two great assets great precious assets that he has held up to this point. One, we are talking about initiative. He should have, in fact, gone into discussions, political talks with his main rival before the event, or before the election. Some are calling it a selection. Or he also may have lost, in fact, what you call leverage, because he thought that he would probably get in the neighborhood of about 10 million people coming to vote. Because don't forget that the last time we went to the election, which was annulled, there were about 80% voter turnout, so to speak. Right now, when you look at the numbers and what have you, people are beginning to question some of those numbers, actually. But in fact, those numbers may not have actually existed, and especially because, don't forget that the server, the almighty server of August 8th, has never been accessed. But why hasn't it been accessed? Because it's quite possible that the person who may in fact have won that election may be in that server. And that person probably would not be Uhuru Kenyatta, because if it were Uhuru Kenyatta, frankly, the server would have been opened yesterday.
But Shaka, in all fairness, as we speak today, the IBEC allowed the people, the observers, to come and look at the servers for this election that was held on October 26th. They have allowed people to come and be witnesses to how they did their thing. Before maybe you respond to that, let me go back to the numbers that you talked about.
But before you go to the numbers, what about responding to the server issue that you advanced? If in fact they have provided the server, which is a very good thing, why have they done it now and have not availed the server of the August 8th election?
Well, you could argue that the August election had August 8th election had issues, or they had issues with the servers, and that's why the election was annulled. But
they have never said that to the Kenyan people, nor have I, in fact, have they responded to the Supreme Court, which actually ordered that the server be accessed to representatives of Jubilee, of NASA, and of the Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, we know, at least from a former commissioner of the IEBC, Dr. Rosalind Akombe, that the commissioners of the IEBC, as a matter of fact, instructed the secretariat under Ezra Chiroma, which of course instructions were ignored. That is what this former commissioner said. She has to know really what she's talking about, because after all, she happened to be one of the 7 commissioners.
Shaka, let's go back to the numbers that you referred to. One could argue that 98.26% of the vote is not a small number. In fact, you could also add that he's in the neighborhood with his neighbor across the border, Paul Kagame. Paul Kagame goes for 98. I wonder why he didn't even make it 100%.
That's true. In fact, even if he had wanted, he could have made it 150% out of 100. The problem is who, in fact, would believe him? Let's face it, you are talking about percentages. You shouldn't emphasize more of percentages. You should look at the raw numbers first. As a matter of fact, I remember that on Friday, when the IBC was releasing some of the results and what have you, a man called, of course, Wafula Chebukati, the chairman himself, he actually came up with the audacity of saying that the voter turnout was 48%, without necessarily telling us the number. Normally, you would expect a percentage to come out of the raw numbers rather than the other way around. And of course, a few hours later, he sort of revised it to about 35%. And here we are now going up to 38%, something obviously very close to 40%. Whichever way you look at it, it was a very simple election involving 70 people, but in fact we really had Uhuru Kenyatta running against Uhuru Kenyatta. Because the last time I checked, the number 2 actually, who was not supposed to be on the ballot, who actually came in second, is Raila Amolo Odinga, not the other 6 people who were in the race. You would have expected, frankly, this to be a very simple, straightforward thing, so that we should in fact even have known the results on Thursday night. But guess what, my friend? From Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we got the results Monday. Well, there are people who say they had, of course, some room which would have provided them to get into what others describe or characterize as creative accounting, so that we inflate the numbers so that somebody looks good. As a matter of fact, there is a specific constituency where there was a Jubilee member of parliament, a lady. I remember he was running after returning officer to change the total numbers on the almighty form 34As. Did you see that?
Interesting. Speaking of numbers, over the weekend, the media was reporting, some of the local media was reporting how Uhuru's numbers were actually, that were being displayed on the screens were actually more than the actual number of people who voted. So you could maybe be true in a sense that they were actually what you could characterize as creative accounting, something like that taking place in some areas.
That is why, in fact, if it is true, that's the reason why Uhuru comes to this point. Yes, he wins an election, but of course he wins it at a great cost. They call it a Pyrrhic victory, meaning he actually right now is honestly in a position which makes him much weaker, even though he won. And yet the man who did not even run in that election, which he calls, and a lot of people agree with him, a sham election, actually comes right now, is being seen as in a stronger position. Why do I say that? Uhuru no longer has, again, what I would call the 2 great, vital or precious assets. Initiative to reach out to his opponent, and the other, leverage. Because the perception is that he did not get the numbers. Even his own people in his own region, in fact, can be said, may in fact have rejected him or questioned his leadership. Even though it's quite possible that some of those people in fact come out to vote for Uhuru, especially when he's running against Raila Odinga, so that in fact their goal is to vote against Raila Odinga and not for Uhuru.
Interesting. Let's go to the comments, and let's start with Onyanga Samuel in Uganda. He wants to know what could be the lasting repercussions in Kenya after the IEBC's declaration of Uhuru Kenyatta's victory without the opposition, the main opposition, taking part in this election.
I mean, sincerely, Paul, I have been reading various newspapers and watching shows and stuff like that. It seems to me that the only path to take right now, frankly, is for Kenyan leaders, really, to be reasonable and figure out a way of engaging one another very sincerely and honestly, and chart the way forward for their country. What is needed right now is a political solution. People need to sit down and talk for a long time, and talking about the problems, essentially, that really have bedeviled Kenya since it attained her political independence from Britain back in 1963 up to today. There are people who are saying, wait a minute, we can't really, since 1963, only be ruled by 2 ethnic communities. We're talking about the Kikuyu, who have contributed, of course, 3 presidents, including the founding president, the father of the incumbent president, Uhuru Kenyatta, that was Jomo Kenyatta himself. We're talking about Mwai Kibaki, and we're talking about Uhuru Kenyatta. And then, of course, we did have an interim period where Daniel Arap Moi inherited, of course, the presidency from Jomo Kenyatta back in 1978 and ruled for the next 24 years. And right now we have a William Ruto, a kid from Eldoret, who obviously is also waiting to be running for the presidency 5 years from today. So there are a lot of other Kenyans who are saying, wait a minute, there are 44 ethnic communities in Kenya. It's high time that we saw someone else, either a son of the soil from somewhere else or a daughter of the soil from somewhere else, but not just those two people. So I think they honestly need to sit down and talk seriously and honestly.
Let's go to another comment from Portia Bosiano in Manchester, United Kingdom. I am from Kenya, but Uhuru broke the record. He deserves to be president of Africa after scoring the highest votes than the votes turnout. I mean, people who voted were 6.5 million, but results show 7.5 million. What do you say about that?
Interesting. He obviously, must know what he's talking about, because he is not, in fact, in isolation. I mean, there are a lot of other people who are actually pretty much saying either it's between probably 3.5 to 5 million or 6 million people who actually came out to vote. But this is not surprising. There have been situations in a lot of African countries, sometimes where winners, and especially incumbent presidents, sometimes, in fact, end up scoring in a constituency a number of votes that is greater than the population itself. So it's not surprising.
Let's stay in Kenya. Let's get another comment in from Mukolo Kavuma. Will Kenya be the same after this election? Especially in light that opposition leader Raila Odinga has called for a sort of a massive movement. He's going to sort of create a parallel government.
It's not only that. I think that people are tired. It seems to me that people are tired. I have seen in various, media platforms where people are saying, wait a minute, it can't just be more of the same every 5 years. Every 5 years. For example, we started having this problem in 2007, 2008. Most people would agree that it was not Mwai Kibaki who won that election, but he became president because he had supporters, both from some of his supporters domestically, but largely from the international community. 5 years later, we have the presidency of, again, Uhuru Kenyatta, and there are also people who question that. Then we have, of course, another situation. I think it is high time, again, that these people seriously forget about their egos and what have you. They have to put their country first, not their personal interests or their egos. They have to look at Kenya as being the most important, frankly, because Kenya accommodates about 45 million human beings. So it's not just about two people, really, who are contesting for the presidency. I think Kenya will never be the same again. This has to be a sort of political crossroads. And I think some of these leaders have to step up to the plate and make sure that they make something like positive contributions sincerely, so that Kenya at last enjoys at least some level of social, economic justice for all the Kenyans.
Let's cross over to West Africa. In Liberia, they also have just had an election. They are gearing up for a runoff election. And let's go to Lee Koroma. I'm watching from Monrovia. I'm concerned about our President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf interfering in our election results in favor of footballer George Weah. It's not a good thing for us here in Liberia. We're just talking about that.
Very interesting. I have seen some of those allegations, and those allegations, of course, have been denied by a spokesperson of Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, that she did meet some magistrates and what have you, who are probably connected with the elections and stuff like that, but it was routine. But there is also something interesting in the sense that, a lot of times you expect that incumbent presidents endorse a person who has served under them as a vice president. This time this didn't work that way. President Sirleaf did not endorse her vice president. And in fact, the vice president himself has actually been running through elections trying to distance himself from her presidency, which reminds you probably and me of what happened back in 2000 in the United States when Al Gore, who had been a vice president under Bill Clinton, did not feel, especially because of the controversy of Lewinsky, that Clinton would add value to his, presidency in terms of trying to become the president. And of course, we know what happened. Al Gore, yes, succeeded in distancing himself from the controversy of Bill Clinton and Clinton himself. But guess what? He did not apparently win the election, or at least he was not appointed by the U.S. Supreme Court to be president of the United States.
Very interesting. Let's stay in Liberia along the same lines of the vice president. Let's go to Jerry K. Carpenter. Please let the Liberian people know that our president, Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, never stopped her vice president from resigning or leaving the administration, since he felt he never had an input in her government and he was racing a car park for 12 years. Also, election commissioner head was the Unity Party and including majority of the electioneering workers, polls, etc. So he's saying that this vice president, if he felt like he wasn't contributing to the government, he should have resigned. And how would you respond to that kind of stuff?
Of course, he has a democratic right. I mean, he has, under Liberian constitution, he has the right to do or to choose whatever he thinks is in his best interests. And I think that he felt that, if he can stay on as the number 2 person, which is a heartbeat away from the presidency, the whole thing, the executive mansion in Monrovia, that it probably could work for him. Unfortunately for him, he happens to be against a very popular former world-class footballer, Senator George Weah. And Senator George Weah comes from very humble beginnings. He connects with a lot of ordinary people and the youth. And apparently he's very popular because he was never part of the last government, really, a government that has been accused for condoning corruption and what have you, and probably didn't really do much in terms of development, as some critics have said. So it looks like, really, we're looking at the next president of Liberia being George Weah.
Interesting. Let's go to Namibia. Interestingly, they are asking about Kenya. Let's go to Japhet Utoni. I am watching from Namibia, and my question is, did the people of Kenya vote? Was this an election, or like you like to say, a selection?
Very interesting, of course. It depends again on how you look at it. But when you think about the number that allegedly turned out, whether you believe the first figure, which is about maybe 3 million people, or whether you believe another figure which probably is very close to it, about 5 million people, you're talking about 20% of the registered voters. Even if you believe the figure released by the IEBC, which apparently a lot of people think it is an inflated figure, which is 7.6 million people, that is still below 50% of the Kenyan registered voters, because we're talking about the registered voters being about 19.6 million people. And in fact, on August 8th, which was found to be a sham election and was annulled, as probably it should have been, people who supposedly came up were like 15 million people. We're talking about the neighborhood of 80%. 80% showed up. But this time around, I have told you that even in a place like Gatundu, the home place of President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, people were not enthusiastic. One, of course, might say, well, because they probably assumed he was going to win anyway. But this is a man who was campaigning in full throttle right from the court. Now, annulled, voided his actual win. He was campaigning. Apparently, there is a lot of money that changed hands and what have you. And he was hoping sincerely that at least there could be about 10 million people that would vote for him. Not 10 million people turning out, but 10 million people actually voting for him, so that he could obviously have moved on if he had to get into negotiations, which he has to do. At least he would have had two precious, great assets here. He would have initiative and leverage, which he doesn't seem to have right now. So, my friend from Namibia, this may in fact have been, some have said, a sham election, but others will probably say a selection.
Very interesting. Let's continue with one commenter, I think from Kenya. He said, Shaka, what are you talking about? My friend Uhuru won fair and square. This was an open election. Even if Raila petitions, they annulled, it will be annulled again and Uhuru will win again. Your thoughts?
Very interesting, because let's face it, the last time I checked, the elephant in the room, in fact, was either Raila or boycott. Because let's face it, you have the numbers of those who did not vote are greater than the ones who reportedly actually went out to vote. As a matter of fact, on that basis, some of the analysts have actually said this probably proves that in fact Raila has actually been winning elections since 2008. And again, I come back to my friend from Kenya. If in fact Uhuru Kenyatta won, for example, the election of August 8th, why couldn't they open the server? Because let's face it, they have now opened the servers. Why? Because they know that the Supreme Court would probably order for that, even though in fact it would mean nothing. It would be academic, because Uhuru was running against Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta. But the other server of August 8, where is it? Why wouldn't they open that server? Maybe because the winner of that election may in fact be in that server. And if in fact the winner is in that server, that winner would definitely not be Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, because if it was Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, that server would have been opened yesterday.
Shaka, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
It's very interesting, because it's a continuation of the sort of conversation we are having right now, Paul. We are looking at the update, really, on the politics of the Kenyan repeat election, or selection, if you will. But in this particular case, we are obviously going to look at who won that, repeat election, or selection, as some people would like to suggest. And we find whether, in fact, it is very significant, and if it is significant, what is the way forward?
I thought we had time for one more quick question. This person was saying Raila, as people intimidated people and stopped them to vote. 15 seconds.
No evidence. In fact, the evidence I have seen so far, it is a police force in Kenya, which according to the constitution of 2010 is supposed to be a police service serving the people. Actually turned out very deadly against the people.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for being a great guest. Likewise, to you all, our viewers from all over the world, we thank you so much. Keep tuning in and asking your questions. Thank you so much, Shaka.
Thank you, Paul.
A pleasure talking to you.
You're most welcome.
Yeah.